Exzellenzen,
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is the 17th of May today, the International Day against homophobia, transphobia and biphobia. At the entrance you all received a rainbow bracelet to show your solidarity towards those who have suffered from discrimination and punishments. And in many countries in the world, they must still suffer these today. In non-EU countries, many fear being imprisoned, if not worse, because of their sexual orientation. In the EU, we have values which sets respect and human dignity above a person's political convictions, his or her origins, color of skin, religious or sexual preferences. It is one of the biggest things that we have achieved within the EU to recognize human rights highly. From our experiences with the Second World War, we have learned to value human life, and Europe has enshrined this in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. 8 days ago, as every year on the 9th of May, we honored Robert Schuman, who was born in Luxembourg, who laid the foundation in 1950 for peace in Europe. When we come together in Europe to see how sometimes our fundamental freedoms are self-understood in Europe, well, we must understand the true significance of these. 70 years without war. 70 years without war. However, there are still those who forget or do not understand that peace and human dignity are our highest values. And many may be led by populists' simple words to foster hatred and jealousy and to put these above solidarity. I wanted to welcome you most personally here this evening. Jean-Claude, thank you for being here with us. Jean-Claude, as no one else does, you embody the thought of Europe. There are many who criticize your actions. However, historians in the future will see that you were a committed European. You were the person who was able to lead Europe out of the debt crisis and to save the euro. You were able to work with the Juncker plan, the immense investment plan, to be able to make Europe grow once again and to create jobs once again. You were also the one who were able to transform the technocratical European Commission into an effective institution. You also were able to move the EU through the crisis of migration and Brexit without that the EU fell into pieces. You also were able to lead us forward to proclaim the European Pillar of Social Rights. The list is very long. You also were the one who led the European Parliament to be recognized as the highest democratical institutions and thereby granted more powers. And this is why the European elections, which are just around the corner, are more important than ever. And that is why it is very important to recall that wars, nationalisms, extremisms, and populisms would lead us into the abyss. Europe as a guarantor for unity and peace, this is something that we wish to discuss this evening. I would like to welcome Udo van Kampen very warmly. He has worked for many years for CDF in Brussels. Thank you, Udo, for being here this evening with us. I would also like to warmly welcome the young people who are here amongst us this evening. For me, it's always very important to see young people in the room, young people who participate actively in these citizens' dialogues. Thank you for being here today in Echternach in such large numbers. And in the foyer, you will also be able to see artworks from our young colleagues from the Youth Center in Gasperich. There are 28 artworks for 28 EU member states, and these images speak for themselves via poesy. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this 1672nd Citizens Dialogue organized by the Juncker's Commission. And I would also like to thank everyone also from the Trifolion for their hard work today. Udo van Kampen, you will next have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yuriko. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome also from my side. It's a great pleasure and an honor to lead you through this Citizens Dialogue. Today, for 20 years, I've been reporting from Brussels, and of course, I was also responsible for Luxembourg. And I have also visited your city early on and reported about this wonderful event, the so-called Springprozessen, certain procession, jumping one step forward, two back, and then sideways. Boggles my mind. But today, Jean-Claude, it seems to remind me of the tactics that we're seeing in the EU sometimes. Jean-Claude Juncker. I'm 87 years. In 1987, I came to Brussels for the first time, and this is when we met, and we had the opportunity to talk about all the various stations, the internal market. Maastricht in 1992 was brought into being, the Greek crisis, the economic crisis, the enlargement of the EU towards the east, and I was able to accompany that as a journalist, and Jean-Claude Juncker was always in the first ranks. He helped shape Europe. Without him, we probably wouldn't have the euro today. And that's his great merit. And we've known each other since that time. We appreciate and value each other. And we've also remained in contact also after my active time in Brussels. But today we will have a short dialogue. But you are the audience today. You have the opportunity to ask your questions, to raise your concerns, and to direct them at the first person here in the European Union. And let's give it a try here. I will go along with the zeitgeist. One question, one person. The second question always for a lady. Let's see if we can make this work, and I would like to encourage you, the young people, to ask questions, because during the last European elections I looked at the facts and figures. Participation of those between 18 and 24 was about 30% in Germany, not very high. We can't have this happen again. Please use this opportunity. And let's start with a little dialogue, and then I will open up for you for your questions. Please raise your hands, get up, please briefly state your name. And the second thing is, please speak a maximum of 1 minute, because we really want to have lots of questions here today and discuss them. Jean-Claude, President of the European Commission. We've been President of the European Commission for 5 years now. In November, it may be over, or perhaps your term of office might be extended if the nomination of your successor is delayed and you have to stay in office. Yuriko has already said lots of things. I believe your microphone's working. Yes, it is. Yuriko has already mentioned lots of things what you have achieved. But what, Mr. President, are you mostly proud of? A very good evening to you. Bonsoir. Let me ask one question first. Since the end of the 1980s, we're on a first-name basis. So, yes, let's continue in that manner. So what can we be proud of? Less than we might think and more than others might think. Actually, I'm proud of having made sure over those 5 years that Greece doesn't leave the Eurozone. It was highly disputed. I read memoirs of those who were never with us, and they all bet on Greece. But it was me who insisted, and that's important for me. Our then financial Minister of Finances can't reclaim that for himself. I like him very much, but he didn't. But we were fighting about that, about Greece, not only the two of us, but I also had a fight about that with his boss. But she made the turn in the end, and he isn't there yet. I'm happy with what we achieved in terms of reduction of bureaucracy, of red tape. When I came to Brussels, I had known this before. I found that you have 28 commissioners, but you don't have 28 portfolios that they might cover. Therefore, I introduced the vice president. Timmermans was the first vice president, and then 6 others who are coordinating, because in the Commission we always had this silo thinking. Everyone did what he or she thought of doing well in his or her corner. And this has been changed. In terms of social Europe, we got things moving. Not enough, but we reviewed a guideline, the directive, which was very important. That was very close to the heart of many Luxembourg governments, and we have to continue on that matter. I tried to conclude a maximum of trade agreements with other parts of the world. We hadn't expected that Trump would become American president, and he turned the back on multilateralism. And then we had to prove that we have to cooperate with other parts of the world, and that we would do so. We did this with Canada, with Japan. This was highly disputed in Europe, but was necessary because every billion worth that we export to other parts of the world immediately translates into 14,000 new jobs. And with regard to Canada and Japan, you can imagine what comes out of that. And then we had the Juncker plan, 400 billion of investments, which wouldn't have existed otherwise. It was called the Juncker plan because everyone thought this would fail. Therefore, they wanted to identify the person first who would have been at fault if things had gone wrong. Well, things went well, and now it's called the European Fund for Strategic Frustration. Okay, but I could continue endlessly in that manner. But there have been setbacks as well. I'd like to come back to one thing that you have mentioned. He's also a true deal maker. He's the only one in Europe. Merkel didn't manage that, Macron didn't, the Japanese Mr. President didn't. He was the one who achieved a deal with Donald Trump that there wouldn't be any special customs duties on cars as long as negotiations were still underway. And this has again been extended by 180 days, but now linked with a threat that otherwise the Europeans would have to offer that they would sell fewer cars into the US. How did this go, this deal with him? I can imagine a year ago or so you went through the Rose Garden with him and you said, we have a deal. Now, if you want to know why, how did you manage to do that? I won't tell you. No, I won't. Everyone wants to know. I don't care because I'm still talking to him. It worked. Give me a keyword. Oh, liquid gas and so on. He didn't believe that we would do what we had promised, but of course we won't have any trouble with soy because we're not producing any soybeans. He didn't know that, but I did. I won't explain how we did this, because if you have a strategy, especially in international matters, and you explain your strategy, then your strategy is gone. I will put it down in writing at some point in the future. But we get along well. I do get along well with quite a few people nobody would think about. I got along well with Erdogan, I did with Bush, I get along with Putin and with you. Did you notice he forgot Orban? Well, I don't speak Hungarian. Let's speak about the European elections which are coming up. There is a big worry about fake news. Bannon is active in the internet, that the right-wing populists or also left-wing populists could get 1/3 of the votes on seats in the European Parliament. Those are people who want to destroy Europe, who want to leave the European Union. What has been achieved over 70 years, they want to abolish that. How big is the danger? What do you think, according to surveys, opinion polls? I would like to welcome people here also in the back of the audience, and also in the second hall. I haven't been able to talk to them yet, but I wanted to welcome them as well. Yes, of course, you will get your share of questions as in the main hall here, but there have been so many people, and it's great that organizers have been able to make a second hall available, the Agora room. We won't forget you. So your question was about right and left-wing populism.
In this European election, in which I am keeping out, I'm quite worried. I see a danger, not an extreme left danger, but I see that there is a danger from the extreme right, and this is a serious threat, and it worries me to see this. Because stupid nationalists have already made us suffer so much on this continent and also in this city, and I would not want to see this happen once again. I'm not seeing that AfD, Le Pen, etc. Oh, well, I can't necessarily put everyone in a category here. That's quite a different subject matter. But of course, actually, there's not that much in common between some of these parties, and that's why I'm not all that worried. But I think that with the extreme right, stupid extreme right nationalists, well, with those who are against everyone else. With them, we cannot discuss things with them. We cannot make any agreements with them. And that is why I'm so worried. And the traditional European parties, the people's parties, sometimes give the impression that they are sort of running after or trying to move towards the views of the extreme right, and this is very worrying. The extreme right is something that we must block at all costs. There's a problem in the European Union, or a fact, and that is in 3 member states, the values of the rule of law, in Poland, for example, and freedom of the press in Hungary, or the fight against corruption. Well, these things are happening, and for the first time there has been a procedure which was initiated against these countries. How important is it to hold European values up high? Juncker, Europe is a system based on values. If the fundamental rights in Europe are eroded, well, then basically that is treason towards Europe. We need to look back towards the history and the foundation of the EU. At the beginning of the 50s, it was created by those who believed in their own flesh and who had experienced what it was like to live without the EU. They had experienced what the Nazis did from 1933 to 35 and further to 45. We must look at why Europe was founded, and when we look at both world wars, after these, there was a movement for peace. Sometimes we think that Kohl and Mitterrand were the first who shook hands over the trenches in Verdun. No, there were many before them. German soldiers, French soldiers in the First World War did this. But it didn't work. They also had a movement for peace, but it didn't work. And why did this all not work? Well, because there was anti-Semitism, racism. We were discriminating against those who were different, others. And this is what happens if we disregard European values. And that is why we must fight for these values. In Hungary, in Poland, the situations are quite different. But obviously, the situation in both countries leads us to believe that we must further struggle and strive for European values and to safeguard these. There's a continental question on war and peace, and this is something that sometimes we're not supposed to discuss because it bores young people. Well, then it shall bore young people. But we must discuss it because it is really the fundamental basis of the European Union. And it is something which has led us to develop the EU as it is. But unfortunately, this discussion is sometimes not something which truly makes young people enthusiastic. And therefore, we also need to look at issues which are important for the EU's future, things which move young people, the environment, climate change, and these things. The procedure was launched by the European Commission, and of course it will take some time. Juncker, no, we're already quite far along. Yes, the Commission is being quite stringent here. With Poland, we have launched the procedure. We are trying to work with them, and Franz Timmermans has worked fearlessly. And now I have a further opening question, which is how to be close to citizens. But before that, I would just like to say, I remember how Jean-Claude Juncker said in one of his speeches that we need a Europe that protects and values the concerns of citizens. Now, in the European Union, how about the EU and its relationship to its citizens? Sometimes it is said that in the European Union, politics are made up in ivory towers and there's not enough contact with citizens. So what do you think about that, Juncker? I would like you to stick to the rules of this debate. As when I was Prime Minister in Luxembourg, and then also as top mufti in the Commission, one of my concerns was always that we are always moving away more from the citizens, and I always wanted to change this. The previous Commission had 130 new proposals every year. We had only 20 to 23, because too many proposals are too many. This is not what the European Commission is supposed to do. The European Commission is not supposed to meddle in everyday matters. We are supposed to focus on the big questions. We did this, but there was quite some reactions to this. It was quite difficult, the work that we did there, to be able to work efficiently. I could give you examples. The issue, for example, if we should harmonize European flush toilet systems because they could save energy. Well, I wasn't really against this at first, but then I thought that there's war in Iraq and the Ukraine. There are big issues, and then, well, if we're supposed to issue a press notice, we've harmonized toilet flush systems, that would look quite ridiculous. And now I would like to open the floor to all of you who are with us here this evening. Perhaps you could raise your hands, and it would be very interesting if youngsters could also participate. Please, could you say your name and where you're from as introduction? Here on this side, we have a question on this side. Yes, please. 1 minute. Please stand up and ask your question. And please, your name and 1 minute. Hello, my name is Robin Boga. My question is, as you just mentioned, there are ever more nationalist movements. Movements which say we are in Europe, but we are working against Europe. Movements which say this quite openly. And then on the other side, we have protectionism, and we have an international situation which is worrying. There's North Korea, there are wars. Mr. Juncker, how would you see this? Can we see which one of both is more of a threat for Europe, or is this something that we cannot even determine? Thank you for your question. I find this sofa chair here very uncomfortable. I already threw this cushion out, but when I come back, I'd like to have a normal chair just like yours. Are you comfortable? one is sort of seated like a chicken on a perch. To your question, I think all of these issues are very dangerous. Threats. Moving away from multilateralism on a global scale, the growth of the extreme right. That is also very dangerous because it reminds me of what existed in the past. One of my former ministers is sitting there in the audience. I didn't see you before. And there's also a deputy former minister here. Now back to the question. Every movement or thought which discriminates against others is dangerous. This is true at an international scale and within a country. And these are threats that we must challenge. I am very much in favor of the principle of democracy. Democracy is not something which is self-understood. Democracy is something that we need to fight for. Now, a call out to the Agora room. There's surely a lady who would like to ask a question from the Agora room to respect the principles of gender equality. Yes, please. Good evening. I am Nora Schleich. I'm from Ettelbruck. My wife is so too. Yes, because my mother says I'm supposed to tell you that they know each other. I, of course, laughed at my mom, but now I was able to bring this in. My wife knows me very well, I can tell you that. Europe is a community of values, and it lives through its values. How can we be able to truly awaken this feeling of being committed to European values in young Europeans? Because environmental protection and these values are truly very important. But when we see that there are also other things such as lobbyism, well, in the work of lobbies, we see that these values are perhaps being eroded. Juncker. I am not against lobbying in principle, but I am against lobbying which is unorganized. The transparency register is something which was set up. All commissioners have to write down of which lobbies they are meeting, etc. All lobbies are registered in this register. I set this up because I find it very important to see transparent decision-making processes. And it's very important if everyone knows that I have to be transparent about what I talk about with representatives from lobbies, well then fewer lobbies call, because they do not want it to be known publicly what was discussed behind closed doors. And when we discuss things in the Commission or in the Parliament or in the Council of Ministers, well, we debate less there, more in the Parliament. We often look at the issue of values. With my Vice President, Franz Timmermans, well, I'm truly very grateful for him to have done this. For the first time since the Lisbon Treaty, we have mobilized Article 7. Article 7 states that if the rule of law and the basic values within the EU are curtailed, then there may be a judicial procedure launched against said country. and at the European Court of Justice. And this is what we have now. Last week, the Romanian government was informed that we will no longer stand by and see how the rule of law is being eroded there concerning the judiciary in Romania. And in Poland and in Hungary, we have threatened with measures that we may take. We cannot play around with fundamental values. Perhaps you think I haven't quite answered your question correctly. Germany, France are selling weapons. And what about the weapons lobby? This is what I would like to know more about. Juncker, there are European rules on the export of arms, but there's no EU policy on arms export as such. And on the setting of standards, that is the purview of national states. I am not in favor of arms exports because weapons are not good for peace. If there were no weapons, then there would be no wars and there would be no deaths. Luxembourg is a prime example. We do not produce weapons and we don't have a war either. However, in the past, there was a sort of a question in the air whether there could be weapons, arms factories in Luxembourg, but I was always against this. Weapons do not create peace.
Weapons don't create peace. Any other questions? If this is not the case, I would like to stick with that subject, a common foreign and security policy. Perhaps we should look into that, because everywhere at the borders of the European Union, things are really bad. Things are bad in the Middle East. There are threats, and the European Union is right in the middle. It's politically strong, but in terms of conflicts, it's just an onlooker. Now, what are the efforts and what would you recommend to your successor or perhaps the future generation of how Europe could come closer together towards a common foreign policy and security policy? Actually, you would be much better placed to answer that question. Yes, I've seen what happened with the Iraq war. Juncker, I don't share this very generalized view on the European stance. Without Europe, some things would not have happened, and the Russians are also part of that deal, and the Obama government administration was part of that deal. Trump cancelled it, but I will not be held responsible for Trump's acts. The Europeans are behind the Iran deal, and it would be good if it continued to exist, because there is an element conducive to peace in a highly dangerous situation. It is highly dangerous over there. Let's go away from Iran towards efforts to formulate a common European foreign policy. They were close at it regarding Venezuela, but it was not possible to deliver a joint statement. Foreign policy would have to be unanimous. I repeatedly said, also in my declaration on the State of the European Union, that we should get away from this principle of unanimity, because it is extremely difficult to achieve unanimity with 28 member states to come to a common position. Many governments were hit by this, because actually governments insist on their national sovereignty, especially in terms of foreign policy. we as a Commission have suggested that in some questions of foreign policy, not in all, decisions should be taken with a qualified majority, not if it's about sending soldiers into war. If you do that, you need a decision of Parliament or a presidial decision in countries such as France. But Germany has a parliamentary democracy, and there it's the Parliament that should decide on such things. But in other matters, for instance, we should have majority votes. Two things occurred to me over the past 2 years. In terms of Venezuela, we haven't been able to achieve a joint stance because one member state, due to trade links or for other reasons, did not want to join our stance. In the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, we have not been able, as Europeans, to denounce human rights violations in Venezuela. If we as Europeans should be able to shape things in the world, then in matters of foreign policy, we should be able to take majority votes. And there is a great number of governments who think in the same manner, and that number is increasing. Regarding this highly interesting topic of foreign policy, are there any other questions that could give the President of the European Commission the opportunity to go into further detail here? Is there a question over there? I'm sorry, I was unable to see you.
And I would like to ask how likely it is that Ukraine will ever become a European Union member country, and if it would be a good prevention for further conflicts like in Europe, the enlargement to the east, I mean.
I feel very close to Ukraine. The first summit ever organized between the European Union and Ukraine was on the 5th of September 1997 at 11 o'clock in the morning. We were, as Luxembourg government, in the chair of the European Council, and I organized this summit with Ukraine. Kuchma, a former communist, was the then president. I'm not very much in favor of spreading around promises you can never keep. We are in a process with Ukraine, with the ex-president. I will meet the next president in a few days from now. We are discussing anti-corruption is an important issue. We, as a Commission, have proposed a visa-free regime with Ukraine. It has been done. So, step by step, we'll try to bring these countries and things together. A Ukrainian membership of the European Union is foreseeable in the next 15 years. A membership of Ukraine, a NATO membership, is by far more unrealistic, because this would be seen by the Russians as an immediate provocation. I told Putin the other day, with Ukraine in your influence sphere, you are an empire. Without Ukraine, you are a state, and he doesn't want to be a state. He wants to be an empire. He's very British, Putin, by the way.
Agora, wir haben euch nicht vergessen.
Agora, we didn't forget you, but I believe we still have a question over here, in this area, over here. Please present yourself briefly. A microphone is on the way to you. Agora, I'm calling Agora. There's a microphone, but where's the lady? She's right here. Something's wrong with the microphone, apparently.
I'm Yada, and I would like to refer to the petitions on the crimes of pedophiles and others at a European level. What about the death penalty? Is this an issue which we would like to debate, at least, because they are high-level crimes where millions are spent to keep people alive who perhaps do not want to or do not have the right to be so, because they have taken the lives of victims, and we as humanity must keep safe. So perhaps we could have a debate on the death penalty, just like what is taking place in the United States in certain states. I am going to answer in German. I have to answer in German because Udo only knows a little bit of French. Udo, now this issue once again. We as Luxembourgers speak almost all languages. We speak German and French because
Okay, there'll be an answer back in a minute. No, the question was about the death penalty. I have to say that penal law does not fall into the purview of the European Commission. It has explicitly been taken out. However, in the treaties and the preamble to the treaties, for the entire territory of the European Union, the death penalty is explicitly excluded. I'm a strong opponent of the death penalty. Even in the beginning, when my party was in the opposition, no one wanted to be in the opposition at the time. This is different nowadays. But a social liberal government, socialists and the liberals together. The Justice Minister, Robert Krebs, a socialist, was a good friend of mine. He abolished the death penalty by law, although since 1947, I believe, it has not been used anymore. I published a letter to the editor in Luxembourg, Wort, knowing that the editor would be on vacation, others would be responsible for publishing my letter to the editor. And in that letter, regarding the former Minister of Justice, Robert Krebs, was encouraged by me to stay on track, on this path. The proposal was offered by one party, and I also fought against those who were against the abolition of the death penalty. Some were in favor, some against. But I'd say the death penalty will not help to limit crime. We as normal citizens seem to believe that, or tend to believe that. We're impressed by the fact that there is death penalty on certain crimes, but criminals, murderers do commit crimes because they believe they won't be caught. We keep thinking we will be caught immediately, which we would. But the death penalty does not help reduce violent crimes. I'm strictly opposed to the death penalty. I would like to point out that Luxembourg abolished the death penalty before the French did so. So my French colleagues should take note of that. Please be ashamed of yourselves.
Are there any further questions from the audience? Yes, please. Thank you for giving me the floor. I am from European Youth Luxembourg, Patrick. This week, I went to eat at home, and there was the news in Portuguese. And then there were 5 advertisements for the European elections. But many of the things which were said there did not have so much to do with the EU. Sometimes it is said, I'm going to Brussels because I'm going to represent national interests there. However, on the 1st of May, I drove for 3 hours from Venice to somewhere else, and I saw many posters in Italy, Croatia. And what should the next Commission do to be able to move the citizens of Europe, to be able to make people enthusiastic about Europe? For the time being, there's sort of a bit of a climate of nonchalance. When we speak about Europe, as we should, well, laying things out realistically, well, if we were to speak of Europe in a realistic manner, then enthusiasm would grow. However, unfortunately, this sometimes is not the case. Sometimes after the European councils, European ministers go and give press conferences at a national level, and they say that they were not able to push through their ideas because others did not agree or did not look for a consensus. Well, then the image of Europe that we have is skewed. That is the problem. Nation states are just fighting with each other for the best solution in this case scenario. And that is the problem. Chancellor Merkel said that she is in a boxing ring with Mr. Macron. I can't really imagine this, but the French translated this as saying, we have a relationship in which there is some conflict. That's not quite accurate, is it? That we fight together in a boxing ring for the better solution together. I think that's actually a good way forward. Quick question from me before we move up front to the left here. In an interview in the press, I read, "We no longer love ourselves." And solidarity being a key problem, or the lack of it. Solidarity amongst or between all of the member states is being lost. Juncker, we never love enough, but in Europe we don't love each other enough because we do not know each other well enough. We just don't know enough about each other. But we speak of ourselves as if we were a state. What do we, as citizens of Luxembourg, know of the inhabitants of Lapland in Finland? And what do those in Lapland know about people who live in Sicily? Educational policy is something where I don't really want to say much because it's a domain where others know more. But I think that in our schools we should have more time to learn about others. And this is not happening. We cannot love another if we do not know anything of that person. Sometimes what happens is if you know too much about another person, then you don't love them anymore. But that's something quite different. I think that in European schools there should be a subject called the science of reality. And knowing more about reality would be something good. Udo, solidarity. is being lost. We can see this when we look at the heads of state and government and how they discuss certain issues. Showing solidarity and moving towards a consensus, this is something important. But I have often seen that during European Council meetings, one or two heads of state and government go in front of the cameras and say, well, we have taken this decision, but this is not something that we wish to commit to. No. This is not really the case. 1966, the empty chair, de Gaulle. When we were working on qualified majority and introducing this for agricultural issues, then the French no longer showed up. This is what happened with de Gaulle. He then presented an empty chair, no longer came. So this is nothing new. However, with the continental problems that we have in a Europe of 28, it is very unfortunate that we still see that decisions which are taken together are sometimes not complied with. The Commission, as the guardian of the treaties, is there to ensure that this must be done. We have about 500 infringement procedures every year. We have almost 200 ongoing, or which have been rejected. There is a general framework of the EU which truly the member states need to comply with. There's something which is mentioned time and time again. Solidarity. Is it difficult to reach a consensus and to find one solution? This is what is often said. Juncker. This is something which some say. Slovakia and the new member states, or those who have acceded in 2004, well, let's say the younger members of the EU, are not the only ones who are at fault when it is difficult to take decisions between the 28. There are also younger member states, as I like to call them, who behave quite like the states which founded the EU, and sometimes the states which founded, the founding states, behave unlike the way in which they should. There are many Italians in Luxembourg, so sometimes we go into demagogy, but no, bravissimo, yes, we heard you from the audience there. It is difficult to reach a consensus, but not more difficult than it was. I'm quite a dinosaur of European politics. I started when there were only 9 member states, and then we grew. Well, soon we'll be 27 once again. No. It's about fundamental principles. And the problem is that we are no longer following the same vision when looking at fundamental principles of the EU. There is a lady from the Agora room who would like to ask a question. Please introduce yourself briefly and your question. I'm Uschi Koch. I'm from the other side of the Sauer. And I would like to contradict some of the youth here. I have youngsters at home who are very much interested in Europe. And I would say they actually find it much easier to communicate amongst each other than we as older people. My question, Mr. Juncker, what about the United Kingdom? it's tragic for me that the United Kingdom wishes to leave. And what about the European elections in this context? Juncker, well, if I had an answer, I would already have received a Nobel Prize. But unfortunately, I was never nominated for the Nobel Prize. But I do have enough prizes. Your issue on youth that you raised, that was not something which you were addressing to me. It was rather at Mr. Van Kampen here. Luxembourg is a reasonable state. He often takes the highlight of the whole debate away from me. Now, what about the elections? Elections are not a joke. We must go and vote. And the problem is that not everyone understands that they must go to vote. What about the United Kingdom? For the past 26 months, I've been dealing with this. Not 8 hours a day, but several hours every day. And this is, well, truly a very difficult road which we have ahead of us and which we must walk down, because the British do not know what they want. I have held so many talks with the Prime Minister, who has paid me visits 10 to 12 times. Sometimes I receive a note and say, at 7 o'clock we have to start our talks. I like her. I like her very much. But we're in a deadlock. And now this has truly, well, become absurd. The UK is still participating in the European elections. Those who want to leave are still going to participate in the elections. And, well, the treaty is the treaty, and they must take part in the elections. Now, in the United Kingdom, there is a debate which has finally been opened between Conservatives and Labour. They talk to each other. This is something which should be crystal clear, but it has only become clear now. Often when existential questions arise, then the solutions also crop up. I am truly looking forward to the results of the debates between Prime Minister May and Mr. Corbyn. The debates were frozen. No, rather, they were put on a standstill.
Und so ist.
Nun hat die kurze Nachfrage.
Okay. Now, one question. The Council, the European Council, has set a new deadline, which is the end of October. Now, my concrete question is, will this be extended again, or is there an end to it at some stage? As far as I know, I will end on the 31st of October, midnight, because that's my mandate ends on the 1st of November. The British will be out then. No, they had wanted to leave before, but it takes some time to take your leave from Europe. I don't like to joke about this Brexit, actually, but it shows that if you lie, if you don't tell the truth, if you don't admit that in a referendum those who know better also get their say. For instance, I've been told not to travel to the UK during that campaign for the referendum because they told us they don't like the Commission in Great Britain. Well, that's some achievement, isn't it? Therefore, we have never been able to contradict them. But if for 40 years you say, well, we remember, but don't feel at ease there, we think it's useful for the British economy. But apart from that, we don't want to have any dealings with the European community. If you're saying Europe, that's just the opening of borders to just any intruders who want to come in. If they think they're not happy with the social policy, they don't want to have the euro, then you mustn't be surprised if people are called upon to vote that they vote against Europe. I wasn't surprised at all. I have witnesses here. I had an excellent British commissioner, Lord Hill was his name. And when the referendum had gone through, was agreed upon, I said, this will go wrong. And he said, no, we'll win. And I told him, I'll give you €1, if you win that referendum. And I get a pound note from you if we lose it. I still keep carrying me that pound note with me here, because that's what I got. Therefore, if it's about important questions, serious things, you have to talk seriously. What did they dislike? And now they're seeing how difficult it is to leave the European Union. Over the past months, we have had 800 to 900 questions the British had never imagined they would be faced to answer. One example, there are 250,000 cats and dogs that every year are taken from the British Isles to the European Union, to the continent. In the case of a hard Brexit, those cats and dogs will be for 4 days in quarantine on the island and for 4 days on the continent. And then 8 days holidays are over. If they had told the British that it's also about cats and dogs, then they would have voted yes to stay in the European Union. Okay, another question on Brexit. Do you know how many cats there are in Germany? No idea. A president of a commission needs to know everything. 14 million. Who researched that? I was informed of that by the Deutschlandfunk radio station. 14 million cats, ship them back and forth. That really shows quite drastically, with 4 days of quarantine on either side. Whoever travels with animals will see that this is not feasible. Did anyone explain to the British that no plane will be able to fly from London to Brussels and then on to Marseille? We now clarified that. What's it called? Because of cabotage, the French term? We extended that for 1 year. But if we were to apply rules directly, if we were legalistic, then there would be an end to any airplanes between Great Britain and the continent. Can we think of a positive thing? After 26 months, that might be difficult, but it's being discussed again and again. Should we have another referendum, new elections? Would that be a way out of that situation? What are we hearing from Great Britain in that regard? Apparently, the political system, and it is a constitutional crisis this country is undergoing, that until a few months ago, in this existential question, the opposition and the government didn't speak to each other. It's good to see that London is now talking to London. That is an advantage. That is progress. In order to find out what the British Parliament wants to do it, I really admire it. It's the oldest democracy. To find out how it thinks is impossible. I talk to many people, not publicly, but I speak to them. By comparison to the British Parliament, the Egyptian Sphinx is an open book because no one knows what's happening in the British Parliament. And now Mrs. May is considering to submit the exit treaty once again to the Parliament, hoping that it would be approved. And we have to get things moving. But I'm sure that on the 31st of October there must be an end to it. People are getting unnerved by this. Deadlines are being extended all the time. You cannot, you have to stop joking with the Europeans. Another topic. A new topic that we could discuss here. Thank you very much. Merci. Jean-Claude. I know your questions are always long or have 1 minute. The founding fathers of Europe dreamed of a unified Europe from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. If I look at things now, we're not yet there, but we're on the Black Sea with Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. Now, my question is, let me start with a comment first. Perhaps we should be proud that the Eastern European member states who have long suffered under communism, that they're now members, and that should be considered as a positive note. If I travel through Bucharest and I look at Ceausescu's large palace and I see the European flag beside the NATO flag, I'm really proud. Now, what was your question, please? I had warned you. Until the Ural Mountains is still some way to go. The INF Treaty has been terminated, which was the foundation for the fact that the Cold War in Europe was ended. It was cancelled by Donald Trump. Now, how can we achieve stability, including also Russia, to make sure that there's not another arms race? Don't applaud or he'll start again. You're well known, aren't you? No, he's a good friend of mine, says Juncker. A friend. We're party friends, party colleagues. You know what that means. He understands us. How you do amongst party colleagues, party friends. I'm not one of those who regret that the extension of the European Union towards Central and Eastern Europe. I had to do with this. And the expansion towards Central Europe, Eastern Europe is not really fitting. The decision was taken in September 1997 in Luxembourg by the European Council. I was the president in the presidency at the time, and we went through with that. It hasn't been easy. We had the Slovak colleague earlier on. Everyone was against Slovakia becoming a member. We agreed nevertheless. On the 5th of August, I was in Bratislava and spoke to Mitchell, the then Prime Minister, and I said, this is not about the Slovak government, it's about the Slovak people. And this is how we presented it to the European Council. So I'm very much in favor of extending the European Union to include countries in Central and Eastern Europe, because I thought it was highly interesting, exciting, also for the rest of the world, that after the fall of the wall, changes in Eastern Europe, we have managed something no one had reckoned with. The European geography and European history has been brought together again. Central and Eastern Europeans have for decades lived on the shaded side of history. And then there was this fresh breeze and they grabbed the opportunity. And therefore, despite all difficulties, I'm convinced that this had been the right step, the right decision. Now, Trump cancelled the INF Treaty terminated it for his side. We didn't. And my opinion is that with Russia, don't want to say I would say that Russia and the European Union should move towards each other, meet each other halfway. Why is this so? We will never be able to say that the Crimean Peninsula have rightly or justifiably been occupied by Russia. What Russia is doing in eastern Ukraine is correct. This is not. It's a blatant violation of international right. But if we look at the security architecture of Europe and want to extrapolate it into the future, then we have to see that peace and well-being cannot be secured in the long run on this continent if we don't get along with Russia. Therefore, we need to talk to Russia. That is a question that does not only concern Eastern European countries, but also NATO. It's unacceptable that at the beginning of the 1990s, we had the NATO-Russia Council, which was established. Mr. Ambassador, you were present. And then if things go wrong, this council doesn't convene. That's simply grotesque. If there's a fire burning somewhere in the world, then the Security Council of the UN doesn't convene. I was present when we started this in the Élysée Palace. I'm a dinosaur, I told you. And I very well remember that day with Chirac, not only because of the NATO-Russia application, but I also heard that Yeltsin said to Chirac, I've always envied and very much admired the French culture. Chirac asked, what? Vadok. Could you repeat that last word, please? Van Kamp. Oh, another question. We just saw this. The young lady. And then Jakob is my name. Is that funny? I have a question regarding the free trade agreement. Talks have been put on ice some time ago. And what do you think? Does TTIP have a future, or how will things continue? There will be no TTIP. There will be a free trade agreement, a limited free trade agreement with the US. But the original idea of having a wide-ranging TTIP, this will not happen anymore. I'm able to be brief here. I'm calling Agora. Very good evening to you. Rafa Singh is my name. I come from the other side, from Trier. And tonight I've been able to appreciate the luxury of just crossing the border, not needing a passport or ID. And all my life I've been able to travel throughout the Schengen region without a passport. But I would also like to say that in our larger region, which couldn't be more European, not many citizens can say how everything works in Europe. What's the Parliament? What's the Commission? And who is my representative, my DEP? Now, could you please tell us what the Parliament, the Commission, and so on can do, and what we as Europeans can do in order to carry that idea forward, even those who are skeptical towards Europe, to explain to them how important Europe is to all of us. It's more than just about flushing toilets and gherkins and so on. Cucumbers. That we got rid of borders, no longer have to stop at the border, but can travel freely, is the biggest, most important success of the European Union. And the regulations that we have found in terms of roaming, that now you can call from your home to anywhere in Europe or send text messages without extra cost. All those are things just to name but two examples that are known or should be known to European citizens. So it should speak to their feelings, not only to their minds. Today we're having the 1672nd Citizens Dialogue. This only goes to show that we are trying to transport European things. We're not traveling for our pleasure. Well, I do. It's fun to be here. But I've done this twice in Romania, in Malta, and anywhere. It's not subject to amusement tax. But we have to want to explain Europe and have to be able to explain Europe. Not everyone can do this. In many citizens' dialogues, I find that I have to deal with questions that have nothing to do with the European Union and the European Commission. We keep reading the European Commission does this and interferes here and there, and then people think we are responsible for everything and in charge of everything. Not everyone knows that we hold ourselves back very much. Therefore, the question was regarding controls on the borders in Europe of the people and advantages of that. I'm really annoyed to find that more and more states want to introduce and are introducing border controls. This is not my Europe. My Europe is one where you can travel freely. This is a big achievement of the European policy after the war. You've been in Agora, haven't you? I remember the times where in Wasserbillig we had to wait half an hour or 1 hour at the border. I have experienced how adventurous my mother has been to take garments from Trier to Luxembourg without being noticed by the customs officers, because if they purchased trousers for me in Trier, I had to wear them immediately. And the customs officer said, "Is this new? Those pairs of trousers?" "No, I've had them for 3 weeks, and I bought them in Eschalzet." And those are the things we had to think about. I don't like that kids are being forced to lie even at an early age.
Yes, a lady up front, please. Sabine Grösser. I'm a journalist here in the Großregion. And I am also a trade union representative, and I'm very worried. I went to Turkey for a media forum a few years ago, and last year once again. And people said I was a Nazi, I was part of the AfD. I was insulted. And I was insulted in terms of not being able to influence politics in Germany. How is the situation for the moment, Turkey and the EU? I need a short break for my thoughts. President of the Commission, yes, please. Have your break for thoughts. In the EU-Turkey negotiations, we decided in Helsinki, September 2009. They started in December 2014 under the Dutch presidency. We went through a few chapters, but did not initiate others. Why did we not speed up the process? Well, because Turkey is moving further and further away from the EU. And I don't like this. And it is not, as one of the Spitzenkandidaten has said, that the Commission President could truly bring the Turkey accession talks to an end. No, that's not the way it is. It would need to have the approval of the European Council. So for the moment, talks are frozen. Of course, there is freedom of the press and other political freedoms which are being eroded. But in Turkey, there is a further problem, and that is that Turkey is not making an effort at all. I said to Erdogan, you hope that we will bring these talks to an end so that you can say that we have brought these talks to an end. But for the moment, negotiations are simply frozen. A concrete question there. When we see that there are thousands of people who are being incarcerated, journalists, people who work for the government in Turkey, why can't we act upon that? Why can't we do something? In the European Parliament, I actually vouched for this. I said that the Turkey is not at all ready to accede to the EU as it stands for now. And that is the status quo. And that is how it stays. In the European Parliament, I stated on the point on Turkey that I believe that journalists belong into their offices and not into prison cells. There's one question up front and then back to Agora. Good evening. Vincent Schronton from Trier. I have a question on tax policy. Taxation is very unequal. Sometimes there's taxation below 1% and for big companies. And this is something which citizens sometimes don't understand. How do you personally see the CCCTB, the Common Corporate Consolidated Tax Base within the European Union? There are many who've come here from Trier today. I like to see that because I'm an honorary member of the city of Trier. This endows me with a certain privilege, which is that I can be buried in Trier for free. But this is actually not part of my immediate ambitions. Well, to use that privilege is not part of my immediate ambitions. We have a draft directive which we've launched, which would mean that internet giants would be taxed increasingly. However, the Council of Ministers has not yet been able to agree on this proposal. For example, we need to set up the Common Consolidated Tax Base, and this has not moved forward quickly enough. Please argue with your ministers, not with me. Who is blocking this issue? Who's blocking this issue? I'm not speaking French, but many are blocking this issue. With which letters do the countries, which are the countries which are blocking this? A previous neighbor of the GDR. A further question from Agora. You have the floor. Good evening. My name is Spang. In the European Union, it's money which counts. What about the financial disasters which have ensured, and what about the future? Juncker, if I had as much money as you had, I would also be worried. Normal citizens can rest assured that their savings are safe. With the new banking regulations that we are putting in place and the new safeguards, your savings are safe. We could be even better prepared in Europe if we had a deposit insurance scheme. So a deposit protection scheme is something which Mr. Schäuble has not agreed to for some time, but this is something which is truly something good. To be able to consolidate the banking union, this is something necessary. But there are few prerequisites. There is the issue of sovereign debt, which must be solved. Some countries are saving, other countries are spending too much. We cannot move forward if rules are not being complied with. If Italy and other countries have their outdated debt left in the banks, then we can't really move forward towards the banking union. Is that what you're saying? Well, then it'll take a very long time. There's a mountain of debt, and which we must be able to solve. We have 3 different points on flexibility which we have added to the banking pact, to the Stability and Growth Pact. But the most difficult points have been, for example, the debates with the Italians, for example, on the Italian budget in July, and how we are going to have to evaluate that budget. But then there was Greece in the past. Germany actually went against the Stability and Growth Pact 19 times. Who actually knows that? You'd have to tell the German public via the German press that Germany actually infringed the Stability and Growth Pact 19 times. Yeah, even you didn't know that. We are completely immune against all of the things that the Commission says. As journalists, we are.
But in concrete terms, and seriously, the latest economic data for Italy show that they are getting worse, and the spreads are increasing, the indebtedness is increasing. And now, how dangerous is the situation? It's not getting better after the concessions the Commission has made. But I read a quotation in the newspaper. Salvini said that the spreads, the interest, I don't care about that. Yes, he can say so because he doesn't know about that. The spreads have increased quite a bit after Salvini had said he didn't want to stick to European rules. We will calculate how much money the Italian budget had to invest in order to serve the debt based merely on the statements of Salvini. It would have been better to shut up. Cheaper, at least. Agora, the lady, please. Good day today. I'm Lara Ludwig. I live near the Luxembourg border in Germany. I'm 18 years old. And this is my question. What do you think how the young people could be made more aware of European elections, because we don't have a duty, an obligation to vote in Germany? My opinion is that every European, also those who live near the border, have to know that on the day they're voting, that's the 26th of May in Germany, that on that day they vote as representatives of Europe. Everyone who's going to vote has to ask him or herself, if everyone voted the same way as I, what would Europe look like tomorrow? Those who vote for right-wing extremists would have to imagine that as well. And if they wrote for the wrong people, the right-wing people, what kind of Europe would we have after the election? So on the day of the election, every European has representative of Europe has to be aware of that. You can't underline how important it is to go to elections, to vote. And if everyone asks him or herself, what would Europe look like tomorrow if everyone voted the same as I did, then things would go wrong. Every vote counts. Every vote counts. I'm starting to get hungry. Every vote counts. I repeat that. I can only confirm that. And how many questions can we still ask? One question, please. Go ahead. Up there. Good evening, Mr. Juncker, Mr. van Kampen. I'm Stever in Luxembourg. My question is that regarding climate protection and environmental protection, and we have the activities on Fridays. What possibilities does the EU have here to be at the forefront of these initiatives in Europe? Without the European Union, we wouldn't have the Paris Climate Agreement. The European Union has had steered this, piloted this from the forefront. We have agreed in Europe to be climate neutral by 2050. Now everyone is claiming for that, but I'm very much in favor of targeting the year 2030, that by that time 30 to 40% of CO2 should have been reduced. I'm always skeptical if we're talking about 2050. By 2050 we're going to have that objective. But what's more realistic is to do the other thing. But I'm satisfied and even happy that these people are taking to the roads. Over the past decades, I've been annoyed that the young people didn't seem to be interested in the important things. When I was young, which is some time back, we've always been in the roads, on the roads, against the Vietnam War, against dictatorship in Portugal, in Spain, and so on. We did that Sunday afternoons and Sunday mornings. But I don't mind the young people taking to the streets on Fridays, because if they didn't do it during school hours, no one would talk about them. Therefore, I really welcome their initiative. At this point, I would like to thank you, to all of you, for your questions and for the discussion, for the very open questions. And most of all, I'd like to thank the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude, for the time, for the open and clear answers to the questions that have been asked. Thank you so much. I believe if we see today how many people have come to this wonderful city of Echternach, how many people have come from across the border, from the neighboring communities, we had to set up a second hall here. Then it shows that citizens want to have the dialogue. And if I look at the figures, 1,600, how many citizens' dialogues the Commission has organized, then this is a great result, and it's the right path to pursue. The policy of Europe is not done in Brussels, but this is what happens in the various member states, in the communities and in the families. Therefore, I can tell you, I have 3 daughters, your age. I want them to appreciate and experience the advantages of the European Union the way I have been able to enjoy them over the past 70 years. This is fantastic. And therefore, many of you here are sitting here, you're multipliers in the schools, in the bars, when you have breakfast, at the work sites. Don't badmouth Europe. Today you have heard examples of how much can be done, how much needs to be done, but also how much has already been achieved. And the best example at the end was what moves us all. Without the European Union climate goals to be set for all 28 countries and not just for one country. We see that those questions cannot be solved at national level. Now we have the opportunity to continue with this evening. There is a wonderful wine that is going to be served, beer probably as well, here by the city of Echternach, and you're all invited by the city to keep on discussing over a good glass of wine. Thank you for your attention. It has been great fun to discuss with you, and thank you again to you, Jean-Claude.